going to talk about true life, there are a few prose and poetry antecedents to it. There's Dante's La Vita Nova, or translated to the New Life. There's also several epic poems, including John Berryman's Dream Songs and W.S. Merman's The Fuhrerbunker and Charles Olson's Maximus poems that you have referenced in True Life and outside of True Life as well. The one connection that I have always made in terms of the structure of True Life, because it has great prose, even though you developed more in the later books like the Vincetti brothers, and there's also books like Lauren Isley's All the Strange Hours that I think has more commonality with True Life than the prior ones that I mentioned, because it merges great insight and science, even if the science is dated, with art. And this is in the same concept, True Life. True Life is more broad and is likely the greater work overall. But let's just talk about some of the influence of True Life, because there are clearly many, and then how you, as we've referenced before, how you made them original, because this is what I would posit is perhaps the most revelatory book ever written, because it takes the highest art form, poetry, and makes it subservient to prose and mixes it into something that neither could do on their own.
Well, La Vita Nuova is the most obvious referent. Probably through a lot of my work, films are too, and the use of very short lines in a lot of the memoirs has that sort of Hemingway-esque sort of rat-a-tat feel, which gives the sense of a film. I generally, it's rare that I have one of the poems in True Life standalone, although I do have maybe about in the 4 books, and it's total about 640,000 words, so it's a little bit longer than Vincetti Brothers in toto, but I have maybe about 6 or 7 standalone chapters that are just the poems. Yeah, I'd say film is probably the biggest influence on it. The ability to shift gears really quick is something that a film can do. Film, because it travels at the speed of light, has the advantage over writing in that if I write about a moment, I can write about a moment in 100 pages. But a film, you're just going to get that little look of one character at another in a particular moment that can tell a lot. So film has the ability to be more concise, and I try to do that with that. There's partly the film, I hadn't actually seen it at the time, but partly the film that I saw that a few years later was Theo Angelopoulos' Eternity in a Day. Theo Angelopoulos, the Greek filmmaker, because he has his character wander in and out of time, very much like Billy Pilgrim from Slaughterhouse-Five and Kurt Vonnegut. And you will see the character moving from one scene, and then he'll turn around and he'll be in another scene or whatnot.
Fellini's La Dolce Vita is also a good comparison to it, even though you had not watched that when you wrote this book, correct?
I wrote True Life from January to September of '04, the 4 books. Yeah, I think La Dolce Vita I first saw in '06, so I hadn't. But which is an interesting thing because it shows you how great minds sort of think alike. You can get things. I'll give you an example of this too. I recently interviewed this young girl about an hour long named Marina Bruno, and she has some really good short films. She's not done anything great yet. She's literally only 20 years old. She's younger than you. But I could see little bits here that if I was a filmmaker, if let's say I was living in the same town with her, I'd say, this is what you need to do. This is how you can do this. You want to structure your story. You know, I can see that she has a mind that's interesting, but when I interviewed her, she hadn't watched many of the classic films that I can see direct influences from. She hadn't watched basically any silent films. There's a lot of silent film imagery that's in her work.
She said that she did not watch The Twilight Zone, correct, too, which is interesting considering that most of her films are very Twilight Zone-esque and have twists on them that are straight from Rod Serling's mouth.
Yeah, but it shows how people, whatever influences, whatever TV shows, she probably saw watered down versions of silent films, watered down version or gags in silent films. She probably saw watered down versions of Twilight Zone twist endings and said, I can do this better. So what happens is you get something, you get two or three or four or five lesser iterations of that. Then someone comes along unknowing of the great thing that spawned these lesser iterations and says, I can do it better. And they raise it up again. And then you say, oh, they find out the original source and they're like, oh, wow. That's happened to me. There are things that over the years I've seen with poems or just about anything I've done in the arts that, someone might say, uh, oh, I remember when the fellow who did the City Pages story on me in '99 told me that my poems reminded him of this fellow who's one of the great grandson of Herman Melville, Paul something or other. Did these longer, more complex poems. I've got the book somewhere. I'm not going to go look for it now. But Paul something,
Paul Blackburn?
not Paul Blackburn, another guy. But and I had never read him, and I read this guy's stuff, and just as the guy who had done the story on me said, I was significantly better. I was like, oh yeah, but I remember he told me how like numbers of people had emailed him saying, how dare you compare this Schneider to this guy? And he said, have you ever read Schneider stuff? No, but how dare you compare him to this guy? Well, if you actually read it, you can see I'm significantly beyond him. Let me just see here. If you want to ask your next question, I just want to look up the guy's name. Let's see, Melville grandson Paul something or other. Paul Metcalf. Yep, he did. He did. Yeah. So Paul Metcalf did very. His prose had poetic moments. Sometimes it was very turgid. He tried to mix in a lot of things, but he didn't have a way with words the way that I do. Genoa, I guess, is his best known book. Let me see. If I look up Paul Metcalf here, and I did get a couple of his books though after this guy said it. But I'm clearly better than Paul Metcalf. How dare you say that? He lived from 1970 to 99. American writer, wrote verse and prose. His work defies classification. And you see all this here, and here's one of the things. Like I'm looking on his Wikipedia page, and I told him about a decade or so ago, some of my fans had started a Wikipedia page, and it's been constantly under attack. Well, not constantly, but here and there over the years under attack by these people who just hate me for some bizarre reasons. But I look at like this Metcalf's page, and Paul Metcalf is not even in a league with me as a writer, but he's been published by some of these minor presses like Coffee House Press in Minnesota, which is a minor press and whatnot. But that gives someone stature, and it's one of those things like if he didn't have the hook of being a relative of Melville, if he would probably. I'm not that he's highly considered now, but his reputation is probably 2 or 3 times greater than it would have been. He'd probably be thought of as a third or fourth rate beatnik writer if he hadn't been related to Melville. But and I'm not saying he's a bad writer, but he has stuff that you look at his stuff and the first thing I say is like, boy, this is really turgid. This is how you can improve this. This is what happens whenever I read. This is why great writing for me is so good, because I don't have to think about and it doesn't bother me about how poorly something is written. And even when something is merely good, I say, God damn, why did he stop it there? Why didn't he go a little bit deeper into that character? Why does this chapter end here? You could have done this here, whatnot. I'm always constantly thinking of ways to piece things together in ways that are new, fresh, but more importantly, great. Because I've always said greatness is the ultimate originality. Things that are great, even something that is great that clearly is an echo or something ekphrastic out of another work. Greatness is almost by definitionally originality. But most critics don't see that because they don't see that the originality isn't just in the theme or the character or the dialogue or whatnot, but how something that is familiar is twisted anew. And that originality is in how you twist it. That's one of the things that is utterly missed by critics, especially film critics. I did an interview with a film critic. Oh God, let me let me look up again. My
Which is it? The one with Alex?
Alex, no, it's a recent one.
There were several bad critics that you have interviewed.
Well, Alex isn't a bad critic.
No, I don't mean Alex. I'm talking about the two that were on with him.
Oh,
Alex is a very
yeah,
good critic.
they were just local guys. They okay. Let's see. The Fellini interview. I recently did this Fellini interview just a few days ago, and they were two good, solid guys, but they were basically historians. They didn't understand fully. They were arguing, for example, I don't know how much you've seen of Fellini, but they were arguing that Intervista, this atrocious 1987 film by Fellini, which I even said was terrible. Well, oh, it had brilliant moments or what? No, it didn't. It's basically an old man Fellini doing bad comedy segments strung together and then bringing back the stars of La Dolce Vita, which is a masterpiece, not only one of the greatest films, if not the greatest film of all time, but certainly a work that's up there in the top 50 or 100 of all time human works. Has these two old fat people there looking at themselves. It is so masturbatory. It is so ridiculously bad. But these two guys are saying that it somehow got greatness in it. They don't understand
What
it. They don't
what was
understand to be objective about art.
what was Ingmar Bergman's last film again? It was another horror show,
Sarah
and
Sarah Band.
the critics that you interviewed over there were also quite generous with that film as well. When it was a
They don't
very
want to credit.
terrible imitation, and it had the same kind of elements that Intervista had, in that it took two of his better actors that he worked with from one of his greatest works, Scenes from a Marriage, and put him in a abominable film with every kind of cliche and bad element that Bergman ever put, and stewed it into an abomination.
Yeah, these people, they claim to be critics. A critic, by definition, has to criticize, has to take a look at things. The most important thing that a critic does is tell you whether or not the work is of quality and why it is of quality or not. You can add in historical things, you can add in culturally relevant things here, but that is more properly the work of an art historian. A critic has to tell you how it works and why it works and get into the mechanics. Most critics don't do this because they don't want to admit that there's such thing as objectivity, but in reality they can't do it. These guys are boobs. They don't know what they're talking about.